If I were to ask you what you thought the most important conflict in world history would be, if you judge it by the ramifications for the participants, the outcomes, and the knock-on effects that would happen for the next few decades, what would it be? The 100 Years' War? The First Crimean War? World War I? The list goes on and on. One war that I think would be overlooked would be the Japanese invasions of Korea at the close of the 16th century. Because these wars would not only be a direct result of the unification of Japan, but would also wind up toppling the Ming Dynasty and set the country of Korea back several hundred years. Hello everybody, I'm Truculent Unicorn, and yes, I am fully aware of the shirt that I am wearing. My people have been offering unsolicited advice, opinions, and horrible fashion for the last few centuries, and now it is my turn to inflict it all upon you through the glories and magic of the internet. If you're here, thank you for paying attention and listening to my rantings, and now on to the main story. Our story begins with two gentlemen from very different backgrounds in the Warring States period or Sengoku era of Japan. This is a vast oversimplification of a very complex and horribly bloody era in Japanese history that I know a bunch of you anime fans are yelling at me right now about how all cool it was, and that's where, yes, a lot of our favorite animes come from. The first participant in our event is a man named Oda Nobunaga. Some of you are probably already up in arms about all this and how much of a badass he was. Yes, he was. He rose to the rank to lead the Oda clan at a very young age, at about 21, by the time most of you should be finishing college or starting your careers, and essentially wound up over the next few decades in unifying Japan. He did this by being extremely ruthless. Not that he was more ruthless than any of the other regional lords or daimyo, to use the local term. He was, in fact, just about as ruthless. But it's worth mentioning that he was also extremely unconventional. One of his he liked to use new tactics, using favorable conditions to ambush opponents. But he also embraced a lot of new technology, specifically one bit of technology that made its way to the shores of Japan via Portuguese traders in the late 1530s, and that would be the matchlock musket, or the Tanegashima. Now, if your particular brand of historical, technical nonsense, or what have you, Ian McCollum over at Forgotten Weapons, 2 months or so before the recording of this video, has an excellent video on the breakdown and operations of the Tanegashima. I'll have a link to that in the description below. But don't go away from that now. You watch this first. Okay, good. Now, the Tanegashima presented a lot of promise to a regional daimyo that Oda Nobunaga was very quick to appreciate. First and foremost, it was a lot easier to train up a bunch of people to use it rapidly. Remember, the main ranged weapon in the Japanese arsenal, and again, we're talking regional lords, not one unified army, would be the Japanese longbow. It's an awesome weapon. They're absolutely wacky. They're getting up to about 9 feet long. They're kind of lopsided. But like the English longbow counterparts, they required a lot of extensive training to use, and use accurately. So you'd have to be training to be anywhere combat effective with a longbow up to about 10 years. Whereas with the matchlock musket, you could take your army of mostly illiterate farmers, fishermen, what have you, shove one of these matchlock muskets into their hands, and go, here, this is how you do this without blowing your own head off, and you'd have a much larger force to be combat effective within the span of at least a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months. And the way that Oda Nobunaga and others would use these is they'd give these muskets to their ashigaru, or foot soldiers, and much like you'd see in European ranks, you'd have one rank kneeling, firing, while another rank is reloading, who would advance, fire, and reload, and bounding forward, getting closer. This was also particularly effective because the Tanegashima, in addition to being a lot easier to train on than the Japanese longbow, also had far greater effective range, and, most importantly, it could pierce Japanese armor within about 100 yards. If you've seen historical or contemporary versions of European versus Japanese armor, you can kind of see why that would be the case. Very different construction between the two, and most commonly, because this was very new technology for Japan at the time, they had not gotten around to bulletproofing. So, once you've gotten close enough to your opponent's ranks, at this point, by the time that they're really scared of the thunder sticks that can pierce their armor, they break and run, and that's when everybody else with the sharp and pointy things from swords, spears, ice cream scoops, sharpened spatulas would run up and start shanking everybody in their squishy bits. And through this tactic, Oda Nobunaga was able to leverage this new technology fairly effectively, completely subjugating anyone who was foolish enough to stand in his way. Or desperate enough. It must be said at this point that the Warring States period was a very tough time to be anyone in Japan. Didn't matter if you were a regional lord that was more conventionally minded or not as martial. If Oda Nobunaga decided that your lands had to become his, there wasn't much you could do about it. You could either let him take it and live with your life, and that's about it, or you could fight to keep the lands that had been in your family's hands for generations and probably get a katana in the throat for it. So you can see why he was pretty effective. Now, the second gentleman that we must talk about today was from a very different background. We don't know too much about his history because his father and mother were poor peasants. We do know that he was born in 1537. His father was a man named Yemen, who was a former ashigaru, or foot soldier, who retired to be a farmer and then very sensibly died of other causes than having something sharp rammed into his skull. Unfortunately, at the age of 8, this would leave Hideyoshi to be the oldest child to fend for his mother, half-brother, and half-sister. I believe that's the extent of his family. And from this point on, we really don't know too much else for what's going on about him, at least not concrete. We have our suspicions. Most stories about Hideyoshi's early life range from being a bandit, and that can span either the idea of being a Robin Hood, rob from the rich, and that's it, to being just a general highwayman. Think along the lines of a bunch of Mad Max extras. Other stories, most of them invented by Hideyoshi himself later on in life, involved him studying at temples, learning how to 360 spin kick someone's head off of their shoulders while playing the bongos really cool and composing poetry. Personally, I'm kind of more inclined to believe the banditry aspect for reasons that we'll see later on. But it must be said that, to his credit, he was able to keep at least his mother, half-brother, and half-sister alive pretty much through adulthood. The next time he really crops up in a big way in history, though, is he winds up joining Oda Nobunaga's army under an assumed, I believe it's an assumed name. Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, I must mention at this point that sources do differ on whether or not this assumed name was his given name versus Hideyoshi. So, some sources I see that his name was derived from a local shrine, Hiyoshi Maru, that his mother prayed to before he was born. Other sources say, no, this was actually his given name earlier, he just changed it through his own myth-making. Either way, he shows up under the name Tokichiro Kinoshita, or Kinoshita Tokichiro. I've seen it written both ways. In Oda Nobunaga's army as a foot soldier when he's 21 years old. And he quickly rises up to and distinguishes himself to the point where he becomes Oda Nobunaga's footman, or technically the term is sandal bearer, but in English you could see how that would be an easy translation. And that could be anywhere between head gopher, head lackey, to like a confidant, like a valet or a butler that you'd be like, hey, you know, is this a good idea? What do you think? You seem to actually have a decent head on your shoulders. And this is also one of those things where Oda Nobunaga was also unconventional, because he was a guy who could recognize game if you had it, okay? And he would listen to Hideyoshi, Kinoshita, Tokichiro, Expialidocious when he had a good idea. And over the next 10 years, by the time that Hideyoshi, we'll just stick with that for the minute. By the way, if in the next few years, when society crumbles and we're all roaming the desert wasteland in leather chaps and gimp masks, please keep whatever name you've got. Whoever is writing down history after we've rebuilt society will thank you for it later. Anyway, back to the story. So, Hideyoshi has distinguished himself over the last 10 years and winds up becoming one of Oda Nobunaga's top generals. He winds up getting married over this time, legally, although he has a bunch of concubines. I could see that being kind of uncomfortable, though, getting pricked and quills everywhere. Apparently, that word means not the North American prickly land animal. It's typically the concubines that get pricked. He winds up getting a really nice set of land awarded through the spoils of war that he's responsible for. And one of the other things he starts doing now over this time period is he's starting to better himself. He was an illiterate peasant for the early part of his life, and now he's taking on aspects of his role model, Oda Nobunaga. So he's learning to not just read and write, but read and write well. He starts appreciating Japanese tea ceremonies, which are very stylized, very formal affairs, very artistic. So he's appreciating the finer things in life. One of the other things I found, actually, too, looking in on this, is a Japanese pastime called, and I'm really sorry if I say this wrong, but as you might have guessed right here, I'm a very silly person. So, called renga. And basically the idea would be that you would take a rhyming couplet and base a chain off of it with other people around that would be based off of the previous person's one. It's the rhyming thing from Princess Bride.
At Vicini, he can fuss.
Fuss. Think you like to scream at us?
Probably he means no harm.
He's really very short on charm.
You have a great gift for rhyme.
Yes. Some of the time.
Enough of that!
Fuzzy, are there rocks ahead?
If they are, we all be dead.
No more rhymes now, I mean it!
Anybody want to feel it?
Yeah!
So there you go. You can bust that little factoid out at your next family dinner time. So he's aping himself off of this role model, and he's figured, okay, well, I can recognize success. This guy is successful. Therefore, if I want to be successful, I will follow his ideas. And it works pretty well. He starts writing plays about his early life. This is where a lot of the myth-making comes in, about the whole temple 360 spin hook kick, hoo-da-da-da stuff. And all of this goes pretty well. Now, one of the other guys that we have to introduce at this point is a man named Akechi Mitsuhide. And at this time in history, he's another regional daimyo. He's allied with Oda Nobunaga. Doesn't really like him all that much. And there's various reasons for this. One of the anecdotes that I've scene was at one point where, at a party when they're all drinking and hammering down sake bombs, Nobunaga put Mitsuhide in a headlock and started banging his head like a drum, or as I like to call it back when I was in college, Thursday night. Another situation that carried a little bit more weight for Akechi Mitsuhide was at one point he was arranging the surrender of another clan, and they wound up exchanging hostages. The clan sent two of their sons over to Akechi Mitsuhide's care, and Mitsuhide would send his own mother to the other clan. And hostage-taking has its place in not only feudal Japan, but in European history as well. It's sort of a big deal, where it's like, hey, we'll cement this peace, you take my family, I'll take yours, and we will use these as collateral for all of this peace having nonsense. Oda Nobunaga did not like this, and wound up ordering the two sons to be executed, at which point Akechi Mitsuhide's mother had the same thing happen to her. But one of the things that is always fascinated me about this is the dispassionateness. And to be fair, you're talking about a time period where you had to be ruthless, you had to hold your tongue, otherwise you could wind up at the wrong end of a very sharp, unpleasant implement. So Mitsuhide did everything like all us men do. We bottle it down, we hold it in, and we hope one day we will die and let it go. And that's exactly what he did. For a while. So, all of this waging of war and waging of diplomacy or what have you would be ongoing from about 1561 to the late 1570s, early 1580s. By this point, Oda Nobunaga has wound up deposing the Ashikaga shogun, still not, taken over the emperor, and that sounds like a big deal. Kind of. Again, oversimplification time. The shogun in Japan and the emperor really didn't have a whole lot of political clout or money. All they had was the title. In fact, this lack of power was what had led to the entire Sengoku era in the first place. This lack of control over everything, and stuff got out of hand really quickly. The important thing is that by this point, Nobunaga has effective control over a good chunk of Japan, about half for the sake of argument. That's debatable for where you want to, or how you decide to break up Japan at this point. All of this would change in 1582, when Akechi Mitsuhide decided that he'd finally had enough. The way that the story goes is at one point, while Hideyoshi is off laying siege to the Mori clan at a particular castle, Mitsuhide is ordered by Oda Nobunaga to hold a feast for pretty much all of Oda's retainers. And this is a big friggin' deal, not just because you have to, at your own personal expense, feed a bunch of other people's dudes, but also that money has to come from you. It can't go to your friends or what have you. And you've also have to have entertainment. These very lavish affairs. And at the last minute, Oda Nobunaga says, hey, this big old feast that you've got planned, you're not attending. Take your guys and you go help out our boy Hideyoshi over in this siege. I want to wrap this up as quickly as possible. Thanks for the food, by the way. Akechi Mitsuhide took that personally. So, Mitsuhide does pack up all of his guys. He takes his entire army and marches on the Honnoji Temple where Oda Nobunaga and his son are residing. Now, I can't back this up 100%, but a couple of sources I found said that he didn't actually tell his generals that they were marching on Oda Nobunaga and planning on taking him out. So imagine if you're one of these guys and, you know, you're going out, you're like, yeah, we're going to go join our boy Hideyoshi, we're going to take out these Mori clan guys, it's going to be a great time. Oh, we're actually going against our Oda Nobunaga. That Oda Nobunaga, the demon daimyo of Japan. Okay.
I am gonna kill you! Hey, man! What the f? That was a giant group decision you just made for us.
Like, at that point, it's like, I find it funny on two things. One, it's not your mother getting killed, it's the feast that puts you over the edge. Priorities, I guess? On the other hand, what I do find funny, and during the course of my researching this, I came across a notion or a custom in current Japanese business where when a business employs foreigners, particularly Americans, that they will employ a loud American who, whenever the boss has a visit from the Good Idea Fairy, doesn't have the taboo against like direct confrontation in like a social or professional setting, and can call him out on being, hey, no, maybe we shouldn't do stupid things about business. Let's stay on mission and do it this way. Unfortunately for Akechi Mitsuhide, America wouldn't be invented for another 250 years. So he did what he's gonna do, winds up surrounding Oda Nobunaga, his son, and a few of his retainers, and they all wind up not alive at the end of things. The biggest problem for Akechi Mitsuhide, though, is that Oda Nobunaga and his son would both wind up committing Sudoku. And from that point, especially for Oda Nobunaga, his body would wind up being burned and unrecoverable. This is a big problem for Akechi Mitsuhide because he needs to have that body, or at least some recognizable bit of it, preferably the head, to be like, yes, here is the head of your hated enemy, Oda Nobunaga. He's definitely not alive somewhere out in the woods rounding up resistance against me. Sign on with me, I'll be in charge now. But he decides to make the best of the situation, sends a guy over to the Mori clan, who at this point is the big bad guy for the Oda clan and all of their homies, and say, hey, Oda Nobunaga's dead, sign on with me, I'm going to be in charge, and we'll call off this war for you. Flashback over to Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi is conducting the siege against a Mori clan castle. It's going really well for him. They've got half the castle flooded. He's got enough food, supplies, everything. He's just having a ball for it. And he's like, okay, well, I know Akechi Mitsuhide is going to come by with his guys. We'll have even more people. This will be great. We'll wrap up the siege immediately. And suddenly his picket guys come up with this messenger from Akechi Mitsuhide to the Mori clan. Hideyoshi manages to intercept the message to the Mori clan. And bear in mind, we're talking in the days of horse-carried messengers, okay? This is a big deal. Nothing really happens at this point for everything, unless it's signed, sealed, in paper, in triplicate. Forget instant messaging. That's at least half a millennia off, okay? So he knows that the Mori clan doesn't know, but he knows that Akechi Mitsuhide doesn't know.
They don't know that we know they know we know.
Making quick peace with the Mori clan, wrapping up the siege at the castle, pulling a quick handbrake turn and charging full throttle headfirst down at Akechi Mitsuhide and his remaining retainers. Some sources I found said that Mitsuhide had actually a bunch of his army desert at this point because they were loyal to him, but they also were like, no, we're kind of turning back on our liege lord. This is not a good look. But, take that what you will. Eventually, Akechi Mitsuhide would be hunted down, and at the Battle of Yamazaki would wind up getting his head lopped off by a bunch of peasant partisans who were loyal to Hideyoshi. Which, I mean, yeah, sure, good job, you took out this guy that, yeah, not a very pleasant person to be around, but you didn't really last long enough to make good on it, did you? And now, Hideyoshi has a choice. He can either be a good little soldier, or, at this point, the next best claimant to the Oda clan is basically Nobunaga's grandson, who's about 6 years old at this time. Or, he can do the other thing, the really cool thing, and I'll be in charge now. And basically, from the next 5 years, Hideyoshi would wind up being, in all but title, King of Japan.
It's good to be the king.
Technically, the title that Hideyoshi would eventually wind up with, at this point, would be Kampaku, or Imperial Regent. And this is a direct result of the fact that he was a peasant. Or, at the time of Oda Nobunaga's death, he'd managed to get adopted or to develop his own family name of Hashiba. But since he was still a peasant, he could not be adopted by the remainder of the shogunate or the imperial court. So he adopted the next best thing, which was just Imperial Regent. And they couldn't really do anything about him. Basically, at this point, the shogunate and the emperorship had about as much political clout as Punxsutawney Phil does today. Now, going back to how he got into power so quickly, and was able to subjugate the rest of the rebel or rival daimyo, as we discussed earlier, Hideyoshi was very much a fan of Oda Nobunaga and all of his things, with one exception. See, the way that Hideyoshi would conduct business, if there was a rival daimyo, involved essentially a little bit more wheeling and dealing. And this is partially probably because of his peasant background, where he had a little bit more appreciation for being at the pointy end of the spear, but also more psychologically about how people thought. The way Hideyoshi operated was very different from Oda Nobunaga in the sense that he played it a lot smarter about how he spent his men's lives. For example, let's say if you were a regional daimyo that had managed to stay out of the larger conflicts between any of the larger clans. The only thing that you really had was maybe a beef with the next county over. And then one day, one of Hideyoshi's envoys arrives and says, "Hey, I like the cut of your jib. I know you don't like this particular regional daimyo. I happen to be about to attack this regional daimyo. Sign on with me, and I will give you a lot more land than you previously had. By the way, no pressure or anything, but if you don't sign on with me, I'll be signing on with this other regional daimyo over here, and there's a very good chance he'll wind up with your land. No pressure, take your time. Let me know what you think." Well, you're going to do that because you're self-interested. You want to keep yourself, your family alive, and hey, why not? Let's get some more land. The other tactic that Hideyoshi would pull off is, once that campaign would be successful, typically, with a couple of exceptions, if you were a rival daimyo and you surrendered in a timely enough fashion, preserving your men's lives, his men's lives, and your resources, he'd typically allow you to have, say, a province of your own. Not, so it'd be, okay, there's something in it for you, you surrendered in a good enough time, we'll deal with that then. The exception would be the Hojo clan, but we'll get to that in a minute. The other thing he would do, though, with the daimyo that he bought off, is he would basically do a bait and switch. For example, The exception to all that would be the Hojo clan. They wound up not capitulating quickly enough, and in an alliance between Hideyoshi and another daimyo that had been kind of a foil to him and Oda Nobunaga, a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu, he would wind up annihilating the Hojo clan entirely. And in addition to that, as a payoff to the Ieyasu clan, Tokugawa Ieyasu would wind up with the 8 provinces that were previously owned by the Hojo clan. He just had to give up the 5 provinces that he owned already. And this is the way that Hideyoshi would operate. And it was actually a very clever bit of gamesmanship, because on the one hand, for the daimyo, it was effectively a promotion. You'd wind up with more tax revenue, a better castle, maybe a different, fiefdom. You'd be getting more resources. On Hideyoshi's side, though, it allowed him to effectively introduce a new daimyo that didn't know the local customs, the local peasantry, the who's who of everything, and that prevented them from gaining a major toehold with the peasantry and uprising against him down the line. He really did a good job of cementing his own power base, at least until he started to run out of Japan. So, now's when problems start to crop up. We're about 1588, 1590. At this point, Hideyoshi would wind up creating a final name for himself, the name that we know him through today in history as Toyotomi Hideyoshi, which roughly translates either to, and I've seen it both ways, but most commonly bountiful minister or generous provider. So you can kind of see where his brain is at. He's really leaning into this thing like, yes, all good things flow from Hideyoshi. Come and sign on with me and you'll get paid, you'll have land, your family will be successful, free beer for everyone, that sort of mentality. And that's where he has this idea of conquest. He really is sort of I don't want to say a one-trick pony, but that's kind of where he's coming from for everything, where it's, I know how I'm successful. I can buy off these guys, conquer these other dudes that they're rivals with, and everyone will be happy. Hideyoshi's at this point on the far side of 40, and he has a couple of problems. The first problem is very personal to him. He has practically no heir. He would have a son in 1588, born to his legitimate wife. Unfortunately, the young boy would be dead by the age of 3, and this was actually very devastating to Hideyoshi on his own. He would wind up adopting his half-brother's son, a man named, if I remember right, Hidenaga, yes, at the age of 25 to be his heir. But he had very little people that he could pass the torch on to at this point, and felt that he had to really take things on his own. The other thing that should be mentioned is that at this point, Hideyoshi himself was also starting to really feel his age. Yes, he was only 52, and yes, there is that chestnut about how average life expectancy was actually not a real example of how long you could live. That whole thing, in case you didn't know, is that yes, average life expectancy for a lot of feudal time periods was about 42, 45, but that's because infant mortality was so low. So if you'd make it to adulthood, odds were good you'd manage to live until your 70s or so. At this point, Hideyoshi is pushing, he's a little over 50-ish. His eyesight's failing, he's having bad digestive health. The wear and tear of running this constant campaigning is really starting to affect him physically. The other thing that's starting to happen as well, too, is that now he's got to make a choice between transitioning to peacetime governance and expansion. And if he'd left it here, there's a chance that things could have been different. But I don't think he could have. See, on the one hand, this man has been basically at war for pretty much his entire adult life, even early adolescence. He knows no other way of doing things. And he also knows that he's got to keep these other regional lords busy, because otherwise they're going to start looking back at him like, hey, what do we do now? This tea ceremony is good, you know, these rhyming couplets fine is good, but I'm getting bored. And more importantly, that whole bait and switch situation that he had coming up, it was basically a Ponzi scheme. See, if you had signed on with him early enough, just like any Ponzi scheme, it worked out pretty well for him. There were men at this point who'd been serving with Hideyoshi that grew up in his home village that were making out like literal bandits at this point. But for some of the daimyo that came along a little later, now it's like, well, okay, I see what you did for those guys. What's in it for me? Where's my cut? And at this point, he was fresh out of Japan. The main 3 islands of Japan, I should mention at this point, were Kyushu, Honshu, and I'll put it up on the other screen. The one thing I know for a fact is Hokkaido, the big northern part, would not be in Japanese control until much later. So, all of these areas here. And he was just fresh out of Japan that he could dole out and give new things to. Finally, the one last thing that kept him from really sitting back on his laurels and enjoying the fruits of effectively retirement is that a dream of Oda Nobunaga's, and later on his, because he'd adopt it as his own, would be conquest of China. When the Portuguese showed up in Japan, they had pretty good maps of the world as we knew it to that day, which also showed just how vast China was. And that's a lot of land that you could give out to people that were loyal to you. More to the point, too, China also had this thing where it was viewed, at least in that part of the world, as the center of culture and everything else. If you've heard of Middle Kingdom Syndrome, this is where it comes from, because a lot of culture came from that sort of, or that region. And so, Hideyoshi would start laying plans for the invasion of Korea. At least that was the idea. The trick was that to get to China, they had to go through Korea. And that's where problems started to arise. But that's a subject for another video. Sorry to stop it for you right here like this, but the invasion of Korea would span another 6 years, 7 years in history, and I want to do a couple of videos from right here just to lay the groundwork for what happened and why. And really, the two guys that we have, again, we have to look at these two gentlemen, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, as the final catalyst, if you will, for that invasion. Without these two men putting Japan in a position to be effectively a united country, to also have another desire for conflict and conquest, without that you don't have the following war. Anyway, but like I said, we'll get on that in another video. I'm working on the script and the notes for that right now. I'll be getting to editing this one in a minute, but I did want to say thank you for watching. It does really mean a lot that you're paying attention to me. As you might have guessed, in addition to being very silly, I am also a person that needs a lot of attention. And it really means the most that you're paying attention to me. So if you've made it this far, thank you very much. Anyway, I'm Truculent Unicorn, and I will keep on trucking if you do. I'll see you guys in the next one.